Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, or more appropriately today, friends, Romans, countrymen, this is Brother Chris Lidke, and today I want to talk about Vitruvius. Who the heck is Vitruvius? If you go back and you look at the classical world, there are certain texts that really capture everything that we know about certain elements of Greek and Roman life, art, architecture, and other pieces. As you know, I've taught art history. I'm very interested in the classical world. And one of the books that I keep on my shelf is De Architectura by Vitruvius. It's a 2-book set. The one I have is the Loeb Classical Library, which has the translations. And here we have books 1 through 5. And why am I going to talk about Vitruvius today? Vitruvius is important to Masons because it's where we get a lot of the basis of the use of architecture in our teachings, in our ritual, in our lessons. Clearly, during the Enlightenment, when Masonry is really developing at the end of the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, that's when Vitruvius becomes really important. He's first reintroduced in Italy during the Renaissance, and specifically in Venice. He will then come with Thomas Jefferson over to the United States, creating the neoclassical, the Greek revival, Beaux Art, and so many other architectural forms. So who is this guy? Who is Vitruvius? And this is one of those episodes where I have a number of things in front of me. I'm going to be flipping between them. So there's some stream of consciousness sort of ideas going on here. Now, Vitruvius is around 15 BC. We don't have exact dates for him, so he's right around that period of the early empire. He's a Roman architect and engineer, primarily during the 1st century BC. He's known for his multi-volume work, De Architectura, as the only treatise on architecture to survive from antiquity, hence its importance. And it's often regarded, since the Renaissance, as the first book on architectural theory, as well as a major source in the canon of classical architecture. It's not clear to what extent his contemporaries regarded his book as original or important. This is one of those times where something survives the filter of time, the filter of history. In other words, it's something that made it through the last 2,000 years, from the Romans to us today. And we could imagine there may have been far better books. May have been very different theories and treatises, but this is the one that has been passed down, that has survived throughout all of that time, passing from the Romans probably into the Arabic world, into Islam, where it would have been translated into Arabic probably at Baghdad, possibly at Granada in Spain, and then through a series of events, a series of conflicts, finds its way back into Italy, where it is translated into the Italian and comes down to us from there. Now, he states that all buildings should have 3 attributes: strength, utility, and beauty. Well, that should sound pretty darned familiar. From whence it derives figure, strength, and beauty. And his discussion of perfect proportion in architecture and the human body actually leads people in the Renaissance, such as Leonardo, to go ahead and create the Vitruvian Man. In fact, it's called the Vitruvian Man because of Vitruvius, because of something he's trying to prove from Vitruvius. So his work will be well known. It's going to be copied in the Middle Ages. It comes through the Islamic world as well. And in 1414, it will be rediscovered in Florence. And I say rediscovered really in air quotes here, and then passes on to Leon Battista Alberti, who publishes it in his seminal treatise on architecture. And he's one of the very early architects. The same ideas will be used by Bramante, Michelangelo, and Palladio, who gives us the neoclassical as we know it today, really the government architecture that we see in the United States. And what I want to look at is a specific part of Vitruvius. Now, this is coming, at least my version, is coming from Vitruvius, book 1, or volume 1 of De Architectura. And here I'm looking at book 3, chapter 1. And in my translation, it's on page 159. But he's talking about the human body. And I'm going to read from this and kind of using as a jumping off point to discuss parallels, because it really gives us a great idea of where these Masonic ideas are coming from. Now, according to him, ancient Romans based designs of temples on proportions of the human body. I'm going to tell you that the Greeks are the first to do it. And we see it at the Parthenon. Specifically, we see it elsewhere as well, where they move from these ratios of 1:3, width to length of the temple, to 1:2, and eventually closer to 1.618:1, which is the golden ratio and the ratio found in the human body. With that background, let's continue with Vitruvius. The design of temples depends on symmetry, the rules of which architects should be most careful to observe. Symmetry arises from proportion. Proportion is a due adjustment of the size of different parts to each other and to the whole. As a side note, proportion and ratio is typically what allows us to create a realistic depiction of a human form. If you've ever tried to draw another person, it's typically going to be the proportions and ratios that are off when you realize that the nose is far too small or there's way too much space between their eyes. On this proper adjustment, symmetry depends. Hence, no building can be said to be well designed which wants symmetry and proportion. In truth, they are as necessary to the beauty of a building as to that of a well-formed human figure. Now, on this, I'm going to step aside and mention that if you look at evolutionary biology, we see that humans are pre-programmed to look for symmetry. In fact, that's why if you set up a profile photo for any number of different websites you might be using, typically you don't want a straight-on photo. You want to use a 3/4 pose. Turn your face slightly away from the camera so that your eyes are not looking directly in. It hides asymmetry and makes us look more attractive. That's why Leonardo uses the same principle in the Mona Lisa and so many other pieces. But back to Vitruvius. Back to the well-figured, well-formed human figure, which nature has so fashioned that in the face, from the chin to the top of the forehead, or to the root of the hair, is a 10th part the height of the body. Now we're getting into proportion. From the chin to the crown of the head is an 1/8 part of the whole height. And from the nape of the neck to the crown of the head is the same. From the upper part of the breast to the root of the hair, a 1/6, to the crown of the head, a 1/4. A 1/3 part of the height of the face is equal to that of the chin to the underside of the nostrils, and thence to the middle of the eyebrows, the same from the last to the roots of the hair where the forehead ends. Now he goes on with this, talking about these different ideas, these different proportions. What he's doing is he's recognizing, much like Leonardo was trying to do with Vitruvian Man, that there are specific proportions that make up a well-formed human being, specifically a human male in this case. They're not dealing with the female form. Now, his next argument is interesting because it gets to something. Just so the parts of temples should correspond with each other and with the whole, the navel is naturally the place of the center of the body. And if a man lying with his face upward and his hands and feet extended from his navel as the center, a circle can be described. That should sound familiar. That is Leonardo's Vitruvian Man. That is the drawing. That's his idea. By the way, he's wrong about this. We've discovered since then, during the Renaissance, the center of the body is about a third of the way from the navel to the pubic bone. But for them, they believe that there has to be a landmark there. There has to be a center point, because what creator would create a human form without a center point? Especially if we're trying to apply logic, geometry, mathematics to the organic, to the human form. Getting back to Vitruvius. It will touch his fingers and his toes, the circle. It is not alone by a circle that a human body is thus circumscribed, as may be seen by placing it within a square, again, Vitruvian man. For measuring from the feet to the crown of the head, and then across the arms fully extended, we find the latter measure to be equal to the former. As we all learned in grade school, your wingspan is equal to your height, roughly speaking, assuming you don't play in the NBA. We find, so the lines at right angles to each other enclose the figure will form a square. If nature, therefore, had made the human body so that the different members of it are measures of the whole, so the ancients have, with great propriety, determined that in all perfect works, each part should, by some proportional part of the whole, and since they direct, that this be observed in all works, it must be most strictly attended to in the temples of the gods. What is he saying there? Well, he's restating a very basic Greek premise of temples. In the Greek and Roman world, a temple is both a house to a god could appear there, but it's also what's called a votive offering. In other words, the whole thing is an offering to the god, and offerings to gods should be perfect. And to the Greeks and the Romans, perfection meant that it had to reflect the human form, since humans were created in the image of the gods. Are you seeing where I'm going here? The proportions in architecture take on a peculiar perfection because they reflect the human form as a perfect gift to the gods. In Masonry, we're using architecture in the same way, creating that temple made in the heavens, that house not made of hands. And as we do so, we perfect ourselves. And as we perfect ourselves, we become closer to the spiritual. Masonry in the medieval is not coming up with this from something as simple as a cathedral. They're borrowing it from the classical world, from the Greeks and the Romans. To continue with Vitruvius. If it therefore appear that numbers had their origin from the human form, and proportion is the result of a due adjustment of the different parts to each other and to the whole, they are especially to be commended, who in designing temples to the gods so arrange the parts that the whole may harmonize in their proportions and symmetry. If the temple follows the proportions of the human form, it will be a perfect gift to the gods. This is why we use architecture. This is why we use Masonic tools, the tools of masonry, of operative masonry, because those tools are used to create this perfect form. Therefore, the moral application of those tools should allow us to create the perfect form for another life and to gain as close to perfection as we can in this one. It's truly a remarkable idea that the classical world carried this 2,500 years ago, going back to the building of the Parthenon. And it continues, not in necessarily the architecture of today, although every architect will have read Vitruvius, but that it carries on to this very day. It does really harken back to some of the other ideas we've talked about. The idea of being closer to the divine, climbing the tree of life, as it were, closer to that spiritual realm. This also describes why we have to deal with the orders of architecture. Not only do we deal with them because of the metaphor inherent therein, or the lesson inherent therein, which I talked about in an episode on the orders in architecture back in season 1. But the orders in architecture are necessary to understand so that we can see the perfection of architecture, which reflects the image of man and becomes the perfect gift to God. We're taking something material and making it spiritual. We're using architecture for moral lessons. We're using the tools to improve ourselves. And at the end of the day, that entire idea, that entire concept goes back to this passage from Vitruvius. Again, this is Vitruvius, Book 3, Chapter 1, where you can go and read about this today. And it goes into far more detail in terms of the use of the form, in terms of ratios. In fact, if you ever want to study art, this is fantastic because he goes into those proportions of the human form. Proportions we still use today. Proportions that he believes are the ultimate gift to the gods. Thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Licky, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.